Well, welcome everybody to the second in our presentations for the Research Symposium on this Friday morning. For those of you who are just joining us, we're running a little bit behind because we had some technical difficulties with one of our presenters this morning. So this is the second of our presentations on Friday from Dr. Louise Sweeney Cox, who's talking about how conflict impacts family firm succession. And having enjoyed working with Louise during her project, I'm very excited to hear the presentation. I know that you will too. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Louise, and I'm going to ask those of you who are on this Zoom meeting to use the chat function or the Q&A function to post questions for Louise at the end of her presentation. Louise, take it away.
Good morning, everybody. I'm really happy to be here today, and thank you, everybody, for participating with this and for giving of your time. I know we're all busy. So without further ado, I did an ADP, and I looked at how conflict impacts family firm succession. So this is me. I'm a 2020 graduate of Ashford University, and I got my doctorate in psychology, specializing in organizational development and leadership. And I have a background in behavioral health. Work in progress for me is I'm working with the Colorado Springs Small Business Development Center at the moment and helping them with developing a soft skills track for the business community. So I'm really excited about that. They don't have a soft skills track or any kind of emotional intelligence. So that was something I was really excited about to do. And every summer I work with the incoming cadets at the United States Air Force Academy. And I like doing this. It gives me an opportunity to bring some of the leadership components that I learned with me and share those with the Air Force cadets at a very beginning time of their journey through the academy. So why did I want to work on family business? And I think a dilemma that happened and a situation that happened will kind of highlight some of the reasons why I decided to pursue this subject. So just for example, we had a fourth generation family business owner who, due to a land sale, had to move his business. And in the process of doing that, they had quite a landfall of finance, and they came into quite a bit more money than they thought they would do. And in the grandfather's wish to share this wealth, he decided to give some interest to 10 grandchildren. None of these grandchildren had ever been involved in the business before. The current leader had been a grandchild, but nobody else had been involved and nobody else had any business background. And this started a lot of conflict within the family and really mired in conflict and mired in legal issues. A fourth generation company folded. And as we go through my ADP here, you'll realize how very, very precious a fourth generation company is. So the company folded, and this really kind of highlighted some of the things that I was interested in. And that's what I ended up looking at: succession and conflict, and how conflict might be impacting family firm successions. So family firm statistics, family firms are really very vital to the US economy. They are the original business entity, and they are the oldest, most pervasive forms of business in the US. And so one would imagine with this background that there would be a very clear-cut path to succession. That, you know, they've been around a long time, we know what needs to be in succession, and there's a clear-cut path, but there actually isn't. 62% of the US workforce is employed by a family-owned business, and 78% of all new jobs in the US are created by family firm leaders. So they're really vital to the US economy. So although family firms are vital to the community and to the economy, succession rates are actually chronically low. And Ward in 1987 coined the 30-13-3 terminology. And what that meant was 30%, only 30% of family firms survive into a second generation. Only 13% survive into a third, and only 3% of all family firms transition beyond the third generation. So you will see how precious that fourth generation company, what they lost, how precious that was for the community to lose such a company. And this is what happens to many. And it's not only that the companies are closing, but because it's a family firm, relationships are really impacted as well. And as we go forward, we'll be able to see that. So it's interesting to note too, that in my literature review, 43% of family firms do not even have a succession plan in place. And that was kind of a shocking number to me. I don't know if you can see my little cartoon there, but it basically says to two snowmen, are you prepared should one of you melt? And this is kind of the thing that happens with family firms. They're a distinct business entity and very different from non-family owned firms. And because of that, some things happen a little bit differently, but 43% of family firms do not even have a succession plan in place. So if anything happens to one of them, we don't know what's going to happen with the company. So why are the succession rates so low? And it turns out that family firms are a very, very complex. They are not as easy to look at or to figure out what's going on as a non-family owned firm. There are no clear-cut paths to succession. And it turns out this is a multi-dimensional problem, and it's a multifaceted problem. So trying to get at all these variables that are around takes a lot of care. So what components are important when you're looking to extend longevity? And when I was doing this ADP, there were certain things in the lit review were highlighted as important to longevity. So succession is one of the highest. If you look at the lit review and you look at literature with regards to family firm business, you will see that succession is a very high topic of concern, obviously because it is so low. But one of the other topics of concern was conflict. And, with my behavioral background, and I was looking at family firms, and all I could think of was family systems and what's going on here. And is conflict a consideration or not? And it turns out conflict is also quite a high topic of concern. But there seemed to be quite a research gap or a lack of connection with, is conflict impacting succession or not? So that's where I started to get a grip on what I wanted to do my ADP on, what components are important when we are looking to extend longevity within the family firm. We know it's an important business entity. Why is it not moving forward? And what do we need to attend to when we want to extend longevity? And is conflict actually a consideration or not? So one of the issues when you start doing research with family firms, family business, non-family owned business, there's multiple terms when you start looking at this. There is a distinct information under family business theory. That's what it has evolved in since the 1980s when they first started doing research on family business. It's now evolved into family business theory. But there are multiple disciplines having an influence on family business theory development. Again, this kind of started in the 80s, and much of the research comes from an entrepreneurship or an accounting or in a management or a finance or economics or legal. And then we finally get down to the psychology component of this. There's quite a research gap on looking at a family from a psychological perspective versus looking at it from entrepreneurship, accounting, management, or some of those other. So I think there's like 75 business journals involved when we start looking at this. So we're coming at the problem from an awful lot of different angles. So what I found in my research was that family firm succession really needed more explanation from a psychological perspective. It just didn't make sense to me with my background and looking at this from a family systems that nobody had really dug in there. And there are some studies out there, definitely some out there, but nobody really looked at it from a psychological perspective. And that's what I kind of wanted to do. I want to just get in there and get some more detail, get some more information and find out what is going on here. So the purpose of the study was to deepen the understanding of what was going on with regards to succession and family firm. And then it was also to investigate the role of conflict. What role does conflict play, if any, in this succession? I mean, is it worthy of another look or not? And let me go back. What confounds, what's perplexing is that there is a confounding of family dynamics and work dynamics. And that adds a dynamic, a complication to the question. It adds a complication to the question because we all know that, well, we know from our literature that when you confound family and work dynamics, that there is a higher propensity for conflict to ensue. And it makes sense. I mean, if you're working with your family and an issue comes up at work, and you're trying to sort that at work and somebody gets upset with somebody else, and then you have to go home and sit down and have dinner with the same person. So there's a huge mixing of family and work dynamics. And we do know that that also brings on conflict. So bearing all that in mind, that was what started my study interest. Okay, okay, sorry, I'm missing a slide. Okay, so I decided to do a qualitative study, basically because we needed a lot more rich detail about what was going on. And a case study fit the criteria as the most effective approach for the study. It was a multi-site approach was used, so the researcher, I could highlight different organizational perspectives on the same issue. And I choose participants from a list of top 50 family firms published annually from a well-known reputable business journal. And leaders from 7 organizations who had already completed one succession agreed to participate. And the current leader was related to the previous leader. I also looked at smaller organizations, and what I found when I was doing my research was there was very, very little information on small family-owned businesses. And that didn't really make sense to me because a lot of family businesses are still quite small, 0 to 10 to 50 people in that family business. And I think that's where these family companies are born, and that's where they are growing. And so there was very, very little research on small family firms. And so I decided more to focus on smaller organizations. And I did a face-to-face interview using a semi-structured interview format. And participants also completed a demographic worksheet. And what that demographic worksheet gave me was a bit of background with regards to family, who had formed the company, who was currently in the company, what generation were we in, the children of the leader, and whether the leader thought that the children would be involved in the company again with the next generation. So I got a lot of demographic information that really helped to give me a good background so that when I did interview the leaders, that I had that background behind me. And all 7 participants filled that out ahead of time. And so I had that information. So I used the face-to-face interviews and then the information for that demographic worksheet. And I used a computer-assisted qualitative analysis software, Atlas TI, to analyze the data. And one other thing too, when I started this, I was initially thinking, well, I'll talk to people that are in conflict in an organization, and let's try and find out what's going on. If you're in conflict, you will know more about what's going on with your own company and where you are with succession. And then I had a thought about that, and I thought, well, very few people are actually going to put their hand up and say, yes, please come and talk to me because my company is in conflict. So I approached it from a different angle. I approached it from, let me look at successful family firms. And by successful, I meant somebody that had at least gone through one succession successfully. And let me talk to them and let me find out what worked for you and maybe what didn't work for you. So that's the approach that I took in order to get, the rich information that we really needed. So what components are important for succession? I assembled a list based on the lit review. And the semi-structured interview was based around these components. So the components that are important for succession are family harmony, sibling relationships. And sibling relationships is important because this deals with toxic family members. And as we go, when I talk to you about the findings, toxic family members will become a little bit clearer. But basically, they're detrimental to the functioning of a family firm. And the family firm research have a way of talking about toxic family members, and they refer to this as the Frito Effect, and that's the Frito Effect from the Godfather series. So that is a dysfunctional pattern, dysfunctional behavior, and somebody that's not performing duties correctly, but is in the company because they are a family member. So that came under the umbrella of sibling relationships. Then management of conflict was an important component. How are people managing conflict? How have they come to the family business table? With what skills have they come to the family business table with? Is there a process in your organization for dealing with conflict? So that was of interest. And then the incumbent's willingness to leave. And that's a little bit more difficult. This is something that non-family owned businesses are more susceptible to. So in a family-owned business, because it is distinctly different than a non-family-owned business, and it's distinctly different in a couple of ways. But some of the more important ways are SEW, which is socio-emotional wealth, and this is a factor that is not in non-family-owned business. And really, what it refers to, it emphasizes the value of non-economic objectives. And what it might mean is personal pride in the family name, or continuance of a family culture, or an emotional attachment to the company. Broadly, it's like an emotional bond. And so this is not something that we see in a non-family owned business, because they're not attached to the company. They may not be attached to the name that's been over your door for the last 20 or 30 years. So it is a huge factor in family firm. Incumbents' willingness to leave ties in a little bit with SEW, because it's whether the original owner wants to leave or not. I think I remember reading in some of the literature that one owner referred it to really as a death. So he was so emotionally attached to the company that he really didn't want to leave. He felt that if he left, it would almost be the death of him. And so a lot of owners are very emotionally attached to their firm. So that is a component when we look at succession. And then outside influences. And outside influences really refer to outside help for your company. Do you have somebody that helps you with legal issues? Do you have somebody that helps you with tax issues? Do you have a consultant that might come in that might help you, a family firm facilitator maybe, that might help you through some of these tough conversations that are needed when it comes to succession? So what outside influences were present? So those are the components that I looked at that were important to succession. So some of the key findings that I found. So I'm just going to jump into key findings. And if anybody has questions with regards to the methodology, then go ahead and feel free to ask those at the end. But I'm going to jump into the key findings at the moment. So key findings were: leaders with successful transitions still had conflict to manage. So despite the fact that somebody had a successful transition, there was still conflict to manage. So none of the transitions that the leaders had made were without conflict. They just were able to manage them in some way successfully. And that really ran the gamut. So one of my participants who was probably a poster, this company was probably a poster child for how to succeed, how to successfully have a succession within a family firm. And he introduced me to this moose. So their way of dealing with conflict was they are very, very aware that conflict management was important, and they dealt with it right up front. And this was in their company. They have this moose, and they put the moose on the table if there's a conflict to manage, and then they deal with it. Or this company also brought in a family firm facilitator a number of times and really leaned into their input and their resources as to how to successfully navigate a succession. Other leaders had very little input from a family facilitator or anybody with an expertise on how to transition. Some had tax attorneys or legal help, but I think there was only 2 companies out of the 7 that actually made use of a family firm facilitator or a consultant that would help them with this. And conflict did arise. And there was one company where it got to the point where basically it was hands off the transition, or we're leaving. So there was a lot of conflict to manage. And some of it was detrimental to the family. So it doesn't go, even though you have a successful transition, it doesn't always go easy. So another key finding for me was toxic family members need effective direction. So as I said earlier, a toxic family member is a detrimental, he or she is detrimental to functioning with the family firm. And again, this is something that is unique to family firms, because if you have a toxic worker, there are specific ways that you can deal with them. But in a family firm, there may not be that clear direction as to what to do with the toxic family member. And one leader said to me he was unaware that there were issues for about a year because other employees were uncomfortable coming to him and letting him know that, hey, this relation to you is not performing properly and is doing things that goes against the company's culture. So that's one portion of it. Another toxic family member just didn't. He had personal issues, and because of the personal issues, his alignment with the family firm values got out of place. And so he was asked to leave the company. They tried to work with him, but eventually that person was asked to leave the company. That person was a direct family member. And I know the leader said that, family meetings and family celebrations and holidays were very, very difficult for quite a while. So another way that somebody dealt with a toxic family member, recognizing that this person actually did have some skills in a certain area, and they were able to move that person into an area that highlighted the strengths that this family member did have. So different ways of managing, but none of the successful people that had one successful succession, sorry, that's always a mouthful, none of them kept the toxic family member in the company apart from that one organization, and they were able to deal with it quite effectively. And they did have an outside influence. They did have a family management company come in and help them with that. Current leaders have learned from their own transition and honed skills for future succession, and that was absolutely the case. Every leader that was a current leader had definitely made changes so that the next transition, if there was one, the next transition would be far easier. And maybe one of those changes, I think, was clear roles and responsibilities. Sometimes in family firms, clear roles and responsibilities are not that evident. And so for transitions, that can sometimes, it got a little murky. And so one of the changes that the leaders all were on board with was having very clear roles and responsibilities and a very clear succession process different from their own. So even though it might have been tricky, a lot of the leaders took that information and used it for the next transition, hopefully a little bit easier than what they had. So the key finding with regards to support in the form of peer groups and networking was very, very interesting to me, because nowhere in the literature had I found anything about peer groups and networking and how vital they were to family firm leaders. So what the networking and what the peer groups were was something that was put on by the state. A lot of states and counties and cities have small business development centers, or there was another website where there were CEOs of family firms could get together and meet. But regardless of how this happened, support in the form of peer groups was absolutely vital, because this was where they did a lot of the hashing out of problems that they might have within the company, and also succession issues. and how to deal with a toxic family member, or how to deal with a parent that may not necessarily be willing to leave that company. So this was huge, and I thought this was very, very valuable going forward. So I do have references in as we are recording this. And thank you for the opportunity to discuss my research with you. I apologize for the back and forth in the beginning there with the slides. I couldn't find one slide. It might have been in there, but you know yourself when you're put on the spot, it's like, eek. Anyway, I love the subject. I'm really, it was a fascinating study for me. I loved doing it. I had fantastic participants who talked to me quite a bit. And so I always give them thanks as well. Okay, Dr. Sundstrom, over to you.
Yes, thank you. Very, very interesting presentation, Louise. And I find this a fascinating topic as well. You know, I want to come back to one thing that you said. You said even in successful transitions, there is conflict, but the nature of the conflict changes. And I wondered, you just take a minute or so and tell us, you know, how did the nature of the conflict change?
So how does the nature of the conflict change from
for a group that had a succession plan in place and maybe successful transition? You noted that there was still conflict, but the type of conflict changed.
Yeah, so the types of conflict I think that I came across the most was the incumbent's willingness to leave. There were quite a number of companies where the incumbent either really hung on to being there, and without a clear-cut set of this is your role as we transition to me now being the leader, that got murkied quite a bit. So that was one conflict. And another, so the company that I said was kind of the poster child for succession, those two leaders recognized very quickly that succession had to happen and that there would be a transition. And they were very, very clued in, I think, as to how that had to happen. And this was a third generation company. And the first generation had let happen pretty easily. The second generation, what he did was they talked about the roles, they talked about when it would happen. And then the leader actually moved his office further in the building so that the CEO was highlighted as the new leader. And he tried to stay out of conversations. He was always there as a support, and that support gradually weaned, and they actually still have breakfast, I think, every 2 weeks and kind of talk about the company. So that was just a fantastic transition. But yeah, I mean, the conflict ebbed and flowed with depending what was going on. Right. And there's very little set process in place, I found, on how to deal with conflict. Very little.
An interesting question. Thank you for that answer. Interesting question in the chat is from a participant who says that they live in a rural area and their mind immediately jumped to transition of family farms. And this person asked if there was a specific industry or business focus in your research, and whether or not you thought that this research could also generalize to family farms as family firms. Or maybe that's your next area of research.
Well, I think that was one of the findings, and absolutely rural areas are I thought were an underserved population, rural family firm owners, because first of all, family firm owners are super busy. I mean, they are busy like 7 days a week. They wear many, many hats. And I think access sometimes to some of the networking abilities when you're in the rural is not possible. And I like to refer to this networking as, I come from a psych relationship field, and you know how the date night is very important to a relationship. Well, to me, the networking event was as important, and all the leaders said this. It was like, if I don't make it to that meeting. So when in my ADP, I addressed the fact that rural people just don't have access to this. And I would love to see a remote online support networking peer group for rural family firm owners. And I specifically addressed that. And then the COVID happened, and so many people are doing so much on Zoom. I would love to see that happen and give rural family firm owners the attention and the peer support that they really need.
Yeah, that's great. I think that's your next business line. And just, we do need to wrap it up because we're running a touch late, but just one more question, if you could quickly address anything that really surprised you during your research. And my guess is it's the networking that surprised you. Is that accurate?
Yes, the networking surprised me. It definitely did. I'm trying to think of something else. I think what surprised me too somehow was the next generation really hung on to try and move the company regardless of the conflict. And there was significant conflict. Regardless of that, they really hung in there to try and bring the company into that next generation. And I think some of that, one of my questionnaires was, how much involvement had you with the company when you were a child? And every leader had been involved in that company from when they were a child on. And so it goes to that SEW, I think, that socio-emotional wealth, that some of that was built up, and that contributed, I believe, to the continuation. Because with some of the situations, if they'd thrown their hands up and said, I can't deal with this, you wouldn't have blamed them, honestly. They were difficult. I hope that helps.
Yeah, Louise,
Yeah.
great presentation. Those of you who are on the or on the call here, Louise's email address is there if you'd like to reach out to her with further questions. And Louise, we're going to move on to the next presentation, but you should read the chat. There's some wonderful compliments for you in there. And so thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Louise. And we will move to their next presentation in just a few minutes. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Sundstrom. I appreciate your help.